In this video, we're going to look at some selected questions from Lesson 17 in the Oklahoma Supplement, and this lesson is on analyzing line graphs. Remember that line graphs show changes in data over the course of time, so our goal in analyzing line graphs is to not only interpret trends of data, but to try to make predictions about future data. So we're going to begin on page 100 with questions 10 through 14 that all have to do with this line graph that shows the distance traveled by car. Question 10 says, how many miles did the car travel in 2 hours? So the car obviously at 0 hours had traveled no distance. At 1 hour it had traveled 50 miles, and at 2 hours the car had traveled 100 miles. So your answer is 100 miles. Question 11, what distance did the car travel between 2 and 4 hours? At 2 hours, the car was at 100 miles, and at 4 hours, the car was at 200 miles. So the distance it traveled would be how far the car went from 100 to 200 miles. So I need to subtract those two numbers. 200 minus 100 equals 100 miles. Question 12 says a car travels the same number of miles each hour. How many miles will the car travel in 6 hours? So right now we don't have a 6 on this graph, but knowing that this car travels the same number of miles each hour, we can go ahead and plot a 6 on this graph, and it looks like it is going up 50 every single time, because this was 50, 100, 150, 200. So this would be 250 in 5 hours, and then this would be 300 in 6 hours. So the car will have traveled 300 miles in 6 hours. Question 13 says, about how long would it take the car to travel 450 miles? We could either continue adding points to this graph, or knowing that the car travels 50 miles every single hour, we can do 450 divided by 50. 45 divided by 5 is 9. 10 divided by 10 is 1. So it would take approximately 9 hours. And describe the trend in the number of miles traveled each hour. The trend is, when we're describing trends in graphs, we can say that the trend is either increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. And in this case, the trend as far as the distance traveled is increasing, but the rate at which the car is moving is staying constant, because it is moving constantly at 50 miles per hour. So, but over the course of multiple hours, over the course of the 4 hours that are shown so far on this graph, the distance traveled is definitely increasing. And the other problem I want to look at in this video is question number 15, which says the graph shows the distance a biker travels from home over 3 hours. Describe a possible scenario to explain the data. So this graph shows a bike trip. We've got the distance, or the time in hours across the x-axis, and the distance from home in miles on the y-axis. So right here, this point right here, this point right here is 0 hours, and this biker is 0 miles from home. So I'm just going to write home right here, because the biker hasn't gone anywhere at that point in time. However, over the next half hour, the biker traveled 2 miles from home, and the next half hour after that they traveled another mile from home, because we're then at 3 miles. So between where they began and 1 mile, this point of the graph right here, we are increasing our distance from home. So I'm going to write this biker is traveling. However, at the 1 hour point, between 1 hour and 1.5 hours, this point right here in the graph, this part of the graph right here, we have something, we notice that the distance from home is not changing. We're still at 3 miles this entire time. So at this point, the biker has stopped. And then after this half hour where the biker has stopped, then the distance from home is getting less. we went down to 2 miles from home, and then 1 mile from home, and then finally 0 miles from home. So we're traveling again, but this part right here where we're traveling home. This part was traveling away. This part is traveling home. And then down here, we're back to home again. So if we're thinking of a scenario for this graph, we could say that this is a bike trip, and this person who is riding a bike is traveling away. They're going to a particular destination. They were going fairly fast for the first half hour. Maybe they got tired and they started going a little bit slower for the next half hour, because they went twice as far the first half hour as they did the second half hour. Then they stopped at wherever their destination was. Maybe they were going to a friend's house and stayed there for half an hour. And then over the course of the next hour and a half, they were traveling back towards home at a fairly steady rate.